I didn't mean for it to happen. That's the first thing I need to say. It wasn't some calculated betrayal, some twisted scheme to hurt the people I loved most. But intentions don't matter when the damage is already done. Now I'm alone, standing in the wreckage of everything I destroyed. My boyfriend Kyle won't even look at me. His best friend Mason has disappeared without a word. And me? I'm left with nothing but the silence they've left behind and the weight of my own guilt. It started like most mistakes do, with something small, something harmless. At least that's what I told myself at the time. Kyle and I had been together for 3 years. He was the kind of boyfriend everyone dreams about, thoughtful, kind, endlessly patient. But lately things had started to feel different. We weren't fighting exactly, but there was this distance between us, a growing gap that neither of us seemed to know how to close. I tried to bring it up, but Kyle would just shake his head and say, "We're fine, Olivia. Don't overthink it." But it didn't feel fine. Mason was always around. He and Kyle had been inseparable since childhood. Their friendship more like family than anything else. When we started dating, Mason had quickly become a fixture in our lives. First, I loved it. He was funny, easy to talk to, the kind of guy who could make anyone feel at ease. But over time I started noticing little things. The way his jokes would linger on the edge of flirtation. The way his eyes seemed to linger on me a second too long. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. Until the night I wasn't. It was a Friday and Kyle had to work late. Mason came over to watch a movie. A normal thing for us, something we'd done 100 times before. But that night felt different. We were halfway through the movie when Mason made a comment, something about how Kyle didn't deserve me. I laughed it off, but my stomach twisted. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Mason shrugged, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Just that you're amazing, Liv. And sometimes I think Kyle doesn't see that." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I should have shut it down, should have told him he was out of line. But instead I felt a flicker of something I didn't want to admit, something that felt dangerously close to flattery. One moment led to another, and before I knew it we were kissing. It was over almost as soon as it started. I pulled away, my heart pounding, and Mason looked at me like he couldn't believe what had just happened. "This was a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "Yeah," he agreed, running a hand through his hair. "It was. But the damage was already done. For weeks I tried to pretend it hadn't happened. I avoided being alone with Mason, made excuses to keep my distance. Kyle didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. He was busy with work, with life, with everything except us. But the guilt was eating me alive. Every time Kyle smiled at me, every time he reached for my hand, I felt like a fraud. And Mason's silence was its own kind of punishment. We didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it. But every time we were in the same room, the weight of that one moment hung between us like a storm cloud. The truth came out in the worst possible way. Kyle had planned a surprise dinner for me, a rare gesture, considering how busy he'd been lately. He invited Mason, thinking it would make the evening more special. I should have seen it coming. The tension between Mason and me had been building for weeks, and it finally snapped that night. Kyle noticed, of course. He wasn't oblivious. And when he asked what was going on, Mason cracked. "She kissed me," Mason blurted out, his voice raw and angry. Kyle froze, his eyes darting between us. "What?" "It was a mistake," I said quickly, tears streaming down my face. "It didn't mean anything, Kyle. I swear." But the look on his face told me it was too late. Kyle walked out that night and didn't come back. Mason left not long after, muttering something about how he'd screwed everything up. And me? I was left sitting at the table, staring at the remains of a dinner that would never be eaten. Now weeks later I still haven't heard from either of them. Kyle has blocked me on everything, his phone, social media, even email. Mason hasn't reached out either, and I don't blame him. I've tried to move on, to find some sense of normalcy, but everywhere I go I see reminders of what I lost. The coffee shop where Kyle and I used to spend Sunday mornings. The park where Mason once pushed me on the swings laughing like a kid. The apartment that feels like a shell without them. I thought time would make it easier, but if anything it's only gotten harder. I don't know if Kyle will ever forgive me. I don't even know if he should. All I know is that I can't forgive myself. The first week after Kyle left, I couldn't stop checking my phone. Every few minutes I'd glance at the screen hoping, praying for some kind of message. Even anger would have been better than silence. But nothing came. I sent text after text, each one more desperate than the last. Kyle, please, can we talk? I'm so sorry. I know I messed up. I love you. Please don't shut me out. Eventually the text stopped going through. That's when I realized he'd blocked me. With Mason it was a different kind of absence. He didn't block me, he just disappeared. No texts, no calls, no sign of him anywhere. At first I told myself he was giving Kyle space, letting him process everything. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized Mason wasn't just avoiding Kyle. He was avoiding me too. I thought about reaching out to him, about asking why he dropped me like a bad habit when we were both responsible for what had happened. But every time I picked up my phone, shame held me back. The apartment felt like a tomb. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of Kyle. His favorite mug on the counter, the hoodie he'd left draped over the back of a chair, the framed photo of us from our last vacation. I couldn't bring myself to put any of it away. Instead, I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, haunted by memories of a life that no longer existed. One evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, I called Sarah, one of my closest friends. I messed up, I blurted as soon as she picked up. Olivia, she said, startled. What's going on? I told her everything, the kiss, the dinner, the aftermath. By the time I finished, my voice was raw, and tears were streaming down my face. Wow, she said after a long pause. That's a lot. I know, I whispered. What do you want me to say? She asked, her tone soft but firm. That it's not your fault? Because Liv, it kind of is. Her words hit me like a slap, but I knew she was right. I don't know how to fix this, I said, my voice trembling. Maybe you can't, she said gently. But you need to figure out what you're going to do next. You can't just sit in that apartment forever. Sarah's words stuck with me. I'd been wallowing in guilt and self-pity, replaying every mistake I'd made like a broken record. But the truth was, I couldn't undo what had happened. All I could do was figure out how to move forward. A few days later, I decided to take Sarah's advice. I packed up some of Kyle's things, his hoodie, his mug, the photo of us, and put them in a box. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I taped the box shut, a wave of sadness washed over me. This felt like an ending, like I was finally accepting that Kyle might never come back. For the first time in weeks, I forced myself to leave the apartment. I went for a walk in the park, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But everywhere I looked, I saw couples laughing, holding hands, sharing moments I'd taken for granted when I had them. I sat on a bench, staring at the trees and wondering how I'd let things get so out of control. Later that night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, me, Kyle, and Mason, smiling at a barbecue, huddled together at a concert, laughing in the park. We'd been so happy, so close. And now I destroyed it all. I wanted to blame Mason, to tell myself he'd crossed the line first. But the truth was, I'd made the choice to kiss him. I'd made the choice to betray Kyle's trust. And now I was paying the price. A week later, I ran into Mason by chance. I was at the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle, when I heard his voice behind me. Leave. I turned and saw him, his face pale and tired, like he hadn't slept in days. Mason, I said, my heart pounding. We stood there in awkward silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. How've you been? He asked finally. I laughed bitterly. Terrible. You. Same, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I screwed up, Liv. I never should have. Me neither, I said quickly, cutting him off. Mason nodded, his eyes darting to the floor. I haven't talked to Kyle, he said after a moment. Me neither, I whispered. Another silence. Then Mason looked up at me, his expression raw. Do you think he'll ever forgive us? I didn't know what to say. I don't know, I admitted. But I don't think I'll ever forgive myself. We parted ways without making any plans to see each other again. Mason looked as lost as I felt, and I wondered if he was carrying the same guilt I was, if it kept him awake at night the way it did me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I couldn't keep waiting for Kyle or Mason to fix things. They might never forgive me, might never talk to me again. If I wanted to move on, I had to start with myself. I thought realizing the need to move on would be the hardest part. I was wrong. Letting go wasn't a single decision, it was 1,000 little ones. It was waking up every day and choosing not to text Kyle, even when my fingers hovered over the keyboard. It was resisting the urge to ask mutual friends about him, to scour social media for glimpses of a life I was no longer part of. But most of all, it was learning to live with the knowledge that I'd hurt the two people I cared about most in the world. One night, Sarah invited me out for drinks. "You need to get out of your head," she said when I hesitated. "Just come. You'll feel better, I promise." The bar was loud and crowded, a stark contrast to the silence I'd grown so used to. At first, I felt out of place, like I didn't belong here anymore. But as the night went on, I found myself relaxing, even laughing at Sarah's jokes. For a few hours, I almost felt normal again. But as we were leaving, I saw someone who made my heart drop: Kyle. He was standing near the bar, talking to a group of friends. He looked good, better than I'd expected, like he was moving on in ways I hadn't yet managed. Sarah noticed him too and grabbed my arm. "Do you want to leave?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head. "No," I said, though my stomach churned. I wasn't ready to see him, but I also knew I couldn't keep running forever. Kyle spotted me a few minutes later. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment I thought he might look away. But he didn't. Instead, he walked over, his expression neutral but guarded. "Hi," he said, his voice calm but distant. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely audible. We stood there in awkward silence, the noise of the bar fading into the background. "How are you?" I asked finally. "I'm fine," he said. "You?" "I'm trying," I admitted. Kyle nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good." I wanted to say more, to apologize again, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He didn't want an apology, not here, not now. "Take care, Olivia," he said before turning and walking away. The encounter left me reeling. Seeing Kyle again, hearing his voice, it was like ripping open a wound I thought was starting to heal. But it also made me realize something important. Kyle wasn't coming back. No amount of apologies or explanations could undo what had happened. If I wanted to move forward, I had to stop holding on to the hope that he might forgive me. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into anything that would keep my mind occupied. I started running in the mornings, letting the steady rhythm of my footsteps drown out the noise in my head. One day, as I ran through the park, I spotted Mason sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. For a moment I considered turning around, but something made me stop. "Mason," I said, walking up to him. He looked up, surprised. "Leave." "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He shrugged. "Go ahead." We sat in silence for a while, the awkwardness between us heavy but familiar. "How are you?" I asked finally. "Not great," he admitted. "You?" "Same." He let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, isn't it? We wrecked everything, and now we're both miserable." "It's not funny," I said softly. "It's awful." Mason nodded, his expression somber. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "How stupid I was. How I should have stopped it before it even started." "Me too," I whispered. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with regret. "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think we have to forgive ourselves first." As I walked away from Mason that day, I felt a strange sense of closure. Our conversation hadn't fixed anything, but it had reminded me that I wasn't alone in my regret. We'd both made mistakes, and we'd both have to live with the consequences. One evening, Sarah came over with a bottle of wine and a stack of movies. "You're officially done wallowing," she declared, handing me a glass. "It's time to start living again." I laughed, rolling my eyes. "And what does living again look like?" "It looks like going out, meeting new people, and realizing that you're not defined by one bad decision," she said firmly. I nodded, her words sinking in. "You're right," I said. "It's time." The next day, I signed up for a pottery class. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward. A way to focus on creating something instead of dwelling on what I destroyed. As I shaped the clay with my hands, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope? Pottery became my escape. Every week, I'd show up at the studio, roll up my sleeves, and lose myself in the process of shaping clay into something new. It was messy and imperfect, but it was mine. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Elise, had a way of making everyone feel at ease. Pottery's about embracing mistakes, she said during my first class. Sometimes the flaws are what make it beautiful. Her words stayed with me. One evening, as I worked on a particularly stubborn piece, Elise came over to check on me. "You've got a good touch," she said, nodding toward the clay. "But you're holding back." "What do you mean?" I asked, frowning. She shrugged. "You're being too careful. Sometimes you have to let go a little, trust the process." Her advice wasn't just about pottery, and I knew it. Over the next few weeks, I started applying Elise's wisdom to other areas of my life. I let go of the need to control everything, to anticipate every outcome. I stopped checking Kyle's social media. Stopped replaying old conversations with Mason in my head. Instead, I focused on the present, on the things I could change, the person I wanted to become. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of my mistakes felt crushing, when I wanted nothing more than to crawl back into bed and hide from the world. But each time I felt myself slipping, I reminded myself of something Elise had said. Flaws don't make you unworthy, they make you human. One afternoon, as I walked out of the studio with a lopsided vase in hand, I ran into Mason again. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative. "Hey," I replied, surprised to see him. He glanced at the vase, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That yours?" "Yeah," I said, holding it up for him to see. "It's not perfect, but I like it." "Looks good," he said, nodding. For a moment we stood there in awkward silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "How have you been?" I asked finally. "Better," he said. "You?" "Better," I echoed. Mason hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what you said last time, about forgiving ourselves. And I'm trying," he admitted. "It's not easy, but I'm trying." "Me too," I said softly. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of peace. Mason and I weren't friends anymore. Not really. But there was no anger between us, no lingering bitterness. And maybe that was enough. One evening, as I sat on my couch flipping through a book, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Dinner Friday? You deserve a night out." I smiled, typing back a quick response. "Sounds good. Let's do it." It had been months since I'd allowed myself to enjoy something as simple as dinner with a friend. For so long I'd been stuck in a cycle of guilt and regret, convinced I didn't deserve happiness. But I was starting to realize that happiness wasn't something you earned, it was something you chose. That Friday, as Sarah and I sat in a cozy restaurant catching up over pasta and wine, I felt lighter than I had in months. "You're smiling," Sarah said, raising an eyebrow. "Who are you and what have you done with Olivia?" I laughed, rolling my eyes. "I'm just feeling good, I guess. Like I'm finally moving forward." "That's because you are," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. Kyle and Mason were still part of my story, and they always would be. But they didn't define me anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. No longer waiting for someone else to forgive me, to validate me, to tell me I was enough. I was learning to believe it for myself. One evening, as I cleaned out a drawer in my apartment, I came across a photo of the 3 of us, me, Kyle, and Mason, smiling at the camera during a camping trip. For a moment I considered throwing it away. But then I realized I didn't want to. Instead, I placed it in a small box with a few other keepsakes and tucked it away. The photo wasn't a reminder of what I'd lost. It was a reminder of what I'd learned. Life wasn't perfect and I still had a long way to go. But I was starting to see the beauty in imperfection, in flaws, in second chances. And for the first time, I felt like I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The thing about moving forward is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single decision or a grand moment of realization. It's a collection of small choices, tiny victories that gradually add up. For me, it started with the little things. I began waking up earlier, savoring my morning coffee instead of rushing through it. I took long walks in the park, letting the rhythm of my steps quiet the noise in my mind. I signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. Bit by bit, I started to feel like myself again, or maybe for the first time like the version of myself I wanted to be. One evening, as I chopped vegetables in my tiny kitchen, I thought about Kyle. It wasn't the sharp, painful longing that used to consume me. It was softer now, more like a gentle ache. I still missed him, of course. Part of me always would. But I was beginning to accept that he wasn't coming back, and that I couldn't blame him for that. The cooking class turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd made in a long time. The instructor, Marco, was a lively Italian chef who filled the room with laughter and encouragement. "Cooking is like life," he said during our first lesson. "You have to be willing to make mistakes. That's how you learn." It was a sentiment I'd heard before, but something about the way he said it made it stick. One night, as I practiced making homemade pasta, Sarah came over with a bottle of wine. "Look at you, Martha Stewart," she teased, watching as I kneaded the dough. "More like a work in progress," I said, laughing. She poured us each a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. "You seem good," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Really good." "I think I am," I admitted, surprised by how true the words felt. Sarah smiled, raising her glass in a toast. "To progress," she said. "To progress," I echoed. As the weeks turned into months, my life began to take on a new rhythm. I wasn't just existing anymore, I was living. I made new friends in my pottery and cooking classes, people who had no idea about the mistakes I'd made or the people I'd hurt. With them, I felt like I had a clean slate, a chance to be the person I was striving to become. But I didn't forget the past. Kyle and Mason were still part of my story, and I carried the lessons I'd learned from them with me. They'd taught me about love, about trust, about the consequences of taking things for granted. Those lessons were hard-earned, and I wasn't about to waste them. One day, as I walked through the park, I spotted Mason sitting on a bench. He looked different, more relaxed, like he was finally starting to find his own way. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Hey," I said, my voice tentative. He looked up, surprised. "Leave, hey. Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead," he said, gesturing to the empty space beside him. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, work, hobbies, the weather. It was strange sitting there with him like old times, but also nice. As we got up to leave, Mason turned to me. "You seem different," he said. "I am," I replied, smiling. "You too." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Take care, Liv." "You too, Mason." That encounter left me with a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Mason and I weren't the same people we'd been, and that was okay. We didn't need to be. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected message from Kyle. "Hey, can we talk?" My heart raced as I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect myself from whatever he might say. But another part of me knew this was an opportunity one couldn't pass up. "Of course," I replied. We met at a small cafe, one we'd gone to often when we were together. Seeing him again felt like a punch to the gut, but also like coming home. "Hi," he said, his voice calm but cautious. "Hi," I replied, my hands trembling slightly as I sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Kyle broke the silence. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. "For what?" "For giving me space," he said. "And for helping me see some things about myself. I've been working on stuff on me, and I feel like I'm in a better place now." "That's good," I said softly. "I'm glad." Kyle nodded, his gaze steady. "I don't know if we'll ever be what we were, Liv, but I don't want to carry anger anymore. I just want us to be okay." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "I want that too." As we left the cafe, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Kyle and I might never go back to what we were, but we'd found a way to move forward. And for the first time, I felt like I could truly let go. After that meeting with Kyle, something shifted in me. It wasn't like the past suddenly disappeared, or the guilt evaporated overnight. But hearing Kyle's words, knowing he was finding his way forward, gave me permission to do the same. We didn't become friends again. We didn't text or call or try to rebuild what had been lost. But there was a peace between us now. A quiet understanding that while we couldn't go back, we could both move forward. In the months that followed, my life began to take on a new shape. The cooking classes became a weekly ritual, something I looked forward to with genuine excitement. I even started experimenting in my own kitchen, hosting small dinner parties for Sarah and a few of the new friends I'd made. Pottery remained a constant too, and one evening, as I carefully glazed a bowl I'd been working on for weeks, Elise walked over and smiled. "You've gotten really good at this," she said, admiring my work. "Thanks," I said, smiling back. It's amazing what you can create when you stop worrying about perfection, she added, her tone thoughtful. Her words stayed with me. One day as I cleaned out my closet, I came across a box of old keepsakes, photos, concert tickets, little mementos from my time with Kyle. For a long time I just sat there staring at the box. Part of me wanted to throw it all away, to purge every reminder of the past. But another part of me knew that wasn't the answer. Instead, I carefully sorted through the items, keeping the ones that held good memories and letting go of the rest. The idea of dating again didn't cross my mind for a long time. I wasn't ready, not because of Kyle or Mason, but because I needed to know who I was on my own before I could let someone else in. But one evening, as I stood in the checkout line at the grocery store, I struck up a conversation with the man in front of me. His name was Daniel and he had a warm, easy smile that put me at ease right away. We talked about the weather, about the books in his cart, about the absurdly long line we were both stuck in. By the time he left, he'd slipped me his number. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something new. Our first date was simple. A walk through the park, followed by coffee at a small cafe. Daniel was kind, funny, and attentive, but what struck me most was how comfortable I felt around him. There was no pressure, no need to pretend to be anything other than myself. "I like you, Olivia," he said as we parted ways that evening, "and I'd like to see you again if you're interested." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'd like that too," I said. As Daniel and I grew closer, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through. The mistakes, the heartbreak, the lessons I'd learned along the way. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I was with Kyle, and for that I was grateful. I'd grown. I'd stumbled and fallen, but I'd gotten back up. I'd learned to take responsibility for my choices, to forgive myself, and to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on my couch watching a movie, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, smiling. "You," he said simply. "Me?" "Yeah," he said, reaching for my hand. "I don't know what you've been through, but I can tell it's made you strong. And I really admire that." His words brought tears to my eyes, but for the first time, they weren't tears of regret or sadness. "Thank you," I said softly. Life wasn't perfect and it never would be. But it was beautiful in its own messy and perfect way. I didn't know what the future held for me and Daniel, or for any of the relationships in my life. But I knew this. I was ready to embrace whatever came next. As I stood in my kitchen one evening, carefully arranging flowers in the lopsided vase I'd made in pottery class, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I'd made mistakes, but I'd also made amends. I'd hurt people, but I'd also grown. And in the process, I'd found something I never thought I'd have again: hope.